The village of Middleham Cross, in the county of Derbyshire, on the 28th day of February in the year 1821, began with a knock that Augusta Carrow would remember for the rest of her life. Not because it was loud, but because it was polite. The men who had come for her father did not pound their fists against the door. They knocked with their knuckles, twice, with the same courteous evenness with which a neighbor knocks when he has come to borrow a cup of sugar. And it was precisely that courtesy that told Augusta more than shouting ever could have. People who are certain of their right do not need to hurry. She opened the door herself. Molly, their only remaining servant, had lain 3 days with a fever in the room under the roof, and found on the threshold 2 men in respectable but unremarkable coats, holding a paper folded in 4 and sealed with the blue wax of the county court. "Miss Carrow?" asked the taller of the two, removing his hat with the mechanical, rehearsed courtesy of a man for whom this was already the 7th door that week. "We have come on the business of Sir Humphrey Carrow, by order of the court, for the recovery of a debt owed to Mr. Ephraim Seaton, moneylender, of Derby. The sum of the debt, with interest and costs, comes to £942 and 6 shillings. If the said sum is not paid before sunset this day, we are authorized to convey Sir Humphrey to the debtor's prison at Derby, where he shall remain until the debt is discharged in full, or until such term as the law prescribes." Augusta stood in the doorway of her home, or rather of what remained of the home her grandfather had built on the profits of wool, and which her father had spent, over 20 years, on notes of hand, on standing surety for other men's speculations, and on a stubborn, blind faith that fortune would turn if only he waited a little longer, and listened to a man in a decent coat pronounce a figure equal to everything they had ever owned, in the same tone one might use to read out a grocer's list. Behind her in the cold hall, the clock on the wall showed 11:15. She had a little more than 7 hours. She was 26 years old, and in those years she had come to learn a great deal that a well-bred young woman is not meant to know. How much a pound of tallow candle cost against a pound of wax, and why tallow burned worse but burned longer. How many days a ham would last if sliced thin and its bones boiled 3 times over. Which floorboards in the house creaked, and which could go another year without mending, because there was nothing left to mend them with. She knew the price of things not because thrift came naturally to her, but because thrift had been the one trade left for her and her mother, 3 years dead now, to master to perfection. Her father had never learned to count money. Augusta had learned to count it at 14, on the very day she first opened the estate's account book and understood that the column of expenses had long and hopelessly outweighed the column of income. "I understand you," she said to the man at the door, and her voice was even because she had long ago decided that panic was a luxury afforded only to those who had time to spare for it, and she had never had time to spare. "My father is in his study. Allow me to suggest you wait in the parlor. It is warmer there. I will bring you tea while you wait." She said this knowing perfectly well that there was tea enough in the house for only 2 more pots, and that offering it to the bailiffs meant leaving herself and her father without a hot drink for the better part of a week. But there are rules a woman of her upbringing follows even on the threshold of catastrophe, and one of those rules holds that a guest, even an uninvited one, even one bringing a sentence with him, is met with tea, not with tears. Viktor Frankl, a Viennese physician whose notes on the years he spent in a camp for displaced persons would be published many decades after the events here described, would later observe that a man may be stripped of everything in the world save one final freedom, the freedom to choose his own attitude toward what befalls him. Augusta Carrow would never read that book, but on that February morning, pouring tea from the last of the leaves for the men who had come to take her father, She was doing precisely what he would later write. She was choosing what kind of person to be amid circumstances she had not chosen for herself. Her father sat in his study, where the shutters were closed even by day, not to save candles, but because it had grown difficult for Sir Humphrey Carrow to look upon sunlight on the days the sun happened to shine, when he could not pay what he owed. And when Augusta entered and told him who waited in the parlor, he did not look surprised. That was perhaps the most terrible thing in the whole scene. Her father was not surprised. He lifted his head slowly, like a man who had waited too long for the knock at the door to flinch when it finally came, and said only one word. "Today." "Today," Augusta confirmed. "Before sunset. £942. Sir Humphrey closed his eyes. When he opened them again, there were tears in them, tears Augusta had not seen since the day they buried her mother, and the sight of them made her want to weep as well. Not out of pity for her father, though pity was there too, but out of horror at how quickly a once strong man could turn into an old one, though he was not yet 55. She did not weep. She sat beside him and took his hand in hers, and his hand was cold, though a small fire burned in the room, because fear, it turned out, chilled a man far more surely than any draught. "I have failed you," Sir Humphrey said quietly. "I failed your mother, God rest her soul, and I have failed you. You deserved a better father." "You are my only father," Augusta answered, "and I want no other. We have 7 hours. Tell me exactly who we owe and how much, and do not leave out a single name, because if we are to find a way out, we need the truth, not the part of it that is easier to say aloud." And her father told her, at last, for the first time after years of evasive explanations and promises that all would come right, the whole truth. Of a note of hand issued 3 years before under a neighbor's surety, a neighbor who had since gone bankrupt and fled to the colonies. Of a second loan taken to cover the first, of interest that had compounded faster than Sir Humphrey could invent ways not to pay it. £942, not counting 2 smaller debts to the shopkeeper and the tailor, which had not yet come due, but would. They did not have £942. They did not, if one were entirely honest, have 90. The house that had come down from her grandfather was mortgaged twice over. The land still attached to it brought in less in rents than it cost to maintain. Augusta Carrow spent the following hour calling on the only people in the county worth appealing to on such a day, and each visit was shorter than the last. The parish vicar, the Reverend Wycliffe, spread his hands mournfully and said the parish charity fund did not exist to cover debts of that nature, though her father's debt had nothing to do with cards. There was no time left to explain that it did not. A distant relation of her mother's, a widow of comfortable means, sent a note by her servant expressing regret at their misfortune in 3 cloying sentences, and offered not a single pound. The solicitor, Mr. Wills, the only man of law in the district, whom Augusta had left for last because she feared hearing from him exactly what she did hear, shook his head and said that with £942 owed and the estate mortgaged twice, there existed no lawful means of raising the sum in the hours remaining, unless someone could be found willing to stand surety at once, in cash. It was Mr. Wills, already showing her to the door of his office with the look of a man uncomfortable in his own helplessness, who spoke the name that changed everything. "There is one way, Miss Carrow, which I will tell you of, though I am ashamed to suggest it to a gentleman's daughter. There is a man renting a farm from Squire Pemberton at the far edge of his lands beyond Hazelow Wood. A Mr. Gideon Marsh. Came to these parts some 3 years ago, keeps to himself, but pays his rent on time, down to the last penny, and by all accounts has money. Where from, no one quite knows. There is talk of an inheritance from some distant kin. He came to me last week on a matter of drawing up papers and mentioned in passing that he is looking for a wife. Not for love, Miss Carrow. He said as much plainly without dressing it up. But from practical necessity. His house is too large for a bachelor. His household wants a woman's hand, and he himself, by his own account, is too old and too unsociable to seek a bride in the usual way, through balls and introductions. He asked me whether I knew of any sensible woman in the district, not one chasing pretty words, willing to keep a farmer's house without heirs. I confess I thought of no one in particular at the time. I think of you now. Augusta listened to this proposal the way one listens to a sentence turning out milder than expected, with relief, mixed with something resembling shame. To marry a farmer she had never met, of whom she knew only that he was no longer young, unsociable, and possessed of means enough perhaps to pay off her father's debt. This was not a decision a woman of her upbringing could make lightly. But she did not have the light luxury of choosing between good options. She had a choice between the bad and the catastrophic. And Irving Goffman, a sociologist whose writings on ruined reputation and its consequences would not be composed until more than a century after this day, would later describe what happens to a man whose good name has once been publicly marked by a father's imprisonment for debt. The stain, he wrote, clings not only to the one who earned it, but to everyone standing near him, and society remembers the shape of that stain long after the fault itself has been forgotten. Augusta had not read this, and could not have read it. But she understood by instinct, in the whole of her being, that her father's name, should he end up in the Derby prison, would become a stain not only upon him, but upon her for the rest of her life, and that the only way to prevent it was to pay now, whatever the cost she was able to pay. "Take me to him," she told the solicitor Wills, "at once. We have no time for correspondence or letters of introduction." The road to Mr. Marsh's farm took a little over an hour, first along the turnpike, then down a narrow country track winding through Hazelow Wood, where the bare February branches of the beeches closed overhead like the vaults of some cold stone cathedral. Solicitor Wills drove the horse himself, and Augusta sat beside him, hands folded in her lap, rehearsing to herself the words she would say to a stranger within a few minutes' time. Words that amounted to selling herself for £942. Only it was not her body she was selling, but the whole of the life she had left. She did not weep this time, either. She looked at the bare trees and thought that somewhere, at this very moment, her father sat alone in a darkened study, waiting for sunset the way one waits for a tide that will wash away whatever dignity remained to him. The farm, called Willowcroft, appeared suddenly around a bend, a low stone house under a slate roof, surrounded by outbuildings in decent, if unprosperous, repair. Smoke rose from the single chimney, straight and even, which spoke of a well-swept flue, and that, in turn, of a master who watched over his house more carefully than tenant farmers usually did. Augusta noted this without thinking, with the same eyes she had grown used to turning on the state of her own home, and had no time to finish the thought, for the door of the house opened, and there stood the man Solicitor Wills had called Mr. Gideon Marsh. He was not what she had pictured. She had expected a coarse man, weathered by hard labor, with a farmer's hands and a farmer's speech, and the weathered hands were indeed there, and the speech was plain, without the polish of the capital. But there was something else about him, something Augusta could not then put into words, a certain straightness of the back, a certain manner of standing still and observing before speaking, of a kind not found in men who had spent their whole lives bent over a plow. He looked to be about 40, perhaps a little more, dark hair touched with gray at the temples, a face weathered more by weather than by years, and eyes, gray, calm, too calm for a man who had just been introduced to a strange woman bearing a proposal amounting to a bargain. "Mr. Marsh," said Solicitor Wills, "allow me to present Miss Augusta Carrow." Gideon Marsh looked at her with a long, assessing gaze. Not the gaze of a man looking at a woman he finds beautiful, but that of a craftsman examining a tool before deciding whether it will serve his purpose. And Augusta, instead of taking offense, felt a strange relief. At least this man was not pretending the matter at hand was anything other than a business arrangement. "Miss Carrow," he said, and his voice was low and unhurried, "Mr. Wills has told me of your difficulty. I am sorry to hear of it." "I have no need of your pity, sir," Augusta replied. And these were the first words she said to him, sharper than she had meant to speak. But she had less than 5 hours until sunset, and polite circumlocutions were a luxury she could no longer afford. "I need £942 before the sun sets, or my father will be taken to the debtor's prison at Derby this very day. Mr. Wills tells me you are seeking a wife not for love, but out of household necessity. I am prepared to be that wife, sir, if in exchange you will agree to settle my father's debt at once, in cash or in a note the bailiffs will accept. I do not ask you for mercy. I offer you a bargain, a mistress for your household in exchange for saving my family. If what you require is a woman who can keep accounts, economize on candles, and spend nothing where saving is possible, I am such a woman, and I can prove it within the first week. Decide, sir, I beg you, for I have almost no time left to decide anything myself." She said all this looking him straight in the eye, not because courage came naturally to her, but because she had long understood that the one luxury poverty leaves a person is plain speech, since pretending to prosperity costs more than telling the truth. Gideon Marsh listened without interrupting, and when she finished, his face showed neither surprise nor pity, nor that particular male satisfaction with which some men receive the proposals of desperate women. He simply nodded once, as though she had confirmed something he had already suspected of her. "Very well, Miss Carrow," he said. "I accept your terms. I will draw up the papers with Mr. Wills, sign a note for the full sum of your father's debt before the day is out, and you will marry me as soon as it can be lawfully arranged. By special license, if the Reverend Wycliffe will consent to procure one, since it seems we have no time for banns either. I will not pretend I am offering you a great deal. I am a farmer, not a rich man. My house is plain, there is much work in it, and little society here. I live apart from most of the world, and you will have to grow accustomed to that solitude alongside me. But my word is my word, and your father's debt will be paid this very day, before the sun sets, as you have asked. That is all I can promise you, and it is all I ask in return, that you keep my house as honestly as you have just spoken to me." He did not say where a simple tenant farmer would come by £942 in cash within the space of a few hours. Augusta noticed this strangeness, noticed it, and set it aside, because a man willing to save her father from prison at the cost of his own bachelor peace was under no obligation to explain the source of his fortune to her. And she, for her part, was too grateful, too consumed by one single thought, to succeed before sunset, to ask questions that might unravel everything. She did not ask what estate he had owned before becoming a tenant farmer in Derbyshire. She did not ask why a man of his bearing and manner of speech had chosen the life of a tenant in some forgotten corner of the county. She simply held out her hand to him, not for a kiss, but for a handshake, the way one seals a bargain. And he shook it firmly and briefly, once. And there was more sincerity in that handshake than in all the flowery vows she had ever heard at balls, to which, in truth, she had rarely been invited. The Reverend Wycliffe, on learning that the matter concerned saving Sir Humphrey from the debtor's prison that very day, agreed to procure a special license, though he shook his head at the haste of the whole undertaking. The note signed by Mr. Marsh was, to Solicitor Will's own astonishment, accepted by the bank in Derby without a single question asked, as though Gideon Marsh's signature was worth a good deal more to the bankers than one might suppose from the look of a simple tenant farmer. And this was the second strangeness Augusta noticed, and again set aside, because that evening, less than an hour before sunset, she stood in the small parish church of Middleham Cross, beside a man she had known for fewer than 7 hours, speaking the words of the marriage vow in a voice which, to her own surprise, hardly trembled at all. Her father, saved, stood there at the front pew, weeping openly, unashamed of his tears. And there was no longer in that weeping any trace of the shame that had stood in his eyes that morning. Only gratitude. Only the relief of a man who had been given back not money, but the very right to look his daughter in the eye again. Augusta looked at her father over the shoulder of her newly made husband and thought that if this had been the price, to become the wife of a stranger, to save someone she loved, she would pay it again without hesitation, because some debts are measured not in pounds and shillings, but in what it costs to watch someone you love stop being afraid. She arrived at Willowcroft already after dark, as the lawful wife of Mr. Gideon Marsh, with a single trunk holding everything she owned. And on the doorstep of the house they were met not by a young stable hand or a timid maidservant, but by a tall, spare old man of some 60-odd years with gray side whiskers and eyes that studied her so attentively that Augusta felt, for a moment, uneasy, as though she were being weighed for some purpose she was not meant to know. "Josiah Hepburn, steward of the farm," Gideon Marsh introduced him briefly, helping Augusta down from the carriage. "Josiah has served here longer than I can remember myself. He will show you the house." The old man bowed in a manner more befitting a lady of far higher standing than a tenant farmer's wife. And Augusta, too weary after the longest day of her life to think much on it, noticed only a fleeting surprise in his eyes, an expression that struck her as strangely close to relief, as though old Josiah Hepburn had been waiting for this day a good deal longer than Augusta herself had been waiting for her wedding, and as though her arrival in this house meant something far greater to him than the arrival of a new mistress in the household of a simple farmer. "Welcome, Mrs. Marsh," he said quietly, and in the way he pronounced that name, Augusta thought she heard something strange, something nearly imperceptible, a hesitation before the word Marsh that lasted no longer than a breath, and which most people would likely never have noticed, but which Augusta Carrow, who had spent 26 years of her life listening for what went unsaid between people, noticed distinctly, as though the old man had been far more used to saying a different word before her name entirely. Chapter 2. She woke at dawn in the small, neatly kept bedchamber assigned to her in the east wing of the house, a room that had seemed, the night before, simple, almost austere, but which, in the light of morning, revealed details Augusta had not expected to find in the house of a tenant farmer. The bed linens were of fine Holland cloth, too fine for a household where, by her own reckoning of the evening before, every penny of oil for the lamps was counted. On the small table by the window stood a vase of Saxon porcelain, cracked along the rim and evidently, for that reason, cast off from some wealthier house. But not purchased. Augusta knew the price of such things far too well to believe a vase like that could be bought by a farmer near Hazelow Wood. She ran a finger along the crack in the porcelain and told herself that the piece might well have come down as an inheritance, that not every oddity required an explanation on the very first morning of a marriage. And yet, she set the observation aside all the same, in the same place where, the night before, she had set aside the question of how a simple farmer had come up with 942 pounds in cash within a matter of hours. Their wedding night had passed exactly as Mr. Marsh had promised in his conversation with Solicitor Wills the day before. They were husband and wife in the eyes of the law and of God, but nothing more than that. Gideon Marsh had walked her to the door of her bedchamber, wished her good night with the same brief directness with which he had shaken her hand that afternoon, and withdrawn to another wing of the house. And Augusta, falling asleep alone in the strange bed of a stranger's house, felt not disappointment, but something akin to gratitude. The man she had married to save her father had proven decent enough not to demand more of her than she was prepared to give on the very first evening of their acquaintance. Arlie Hochschild, an American sociologist, would many decades later describe the effort with which a person holds the expression required of them against what is happening within, calling it emotional labor. Labor as real and as exhausting as physical work, though invisible to any onlooker. Augusta, falling asleep that night, did not know this term, but her whole body understood its truth. A day spent maintaining an unfailingly calm, even voice had cost her more than any work about the house she had ever done before. She was woken the next morning not by a bell or a maid, but by silence. That particular ringing silence of a country house where the household had long since risen and set to its tasks, but where no one had disturbed the new mistress, waiting for her to come down of her own accord. Augusta dressed quickly in her plainest gray gown, the very one she had worn to face the bailiffs the morning before, and went downstairs where she found Mrs. Pickles, the cook, a woman of some 50 years with a weathered, kindly face, kneading dough with the deftness of long habit. "Good morning, Mrs. Marsh," said the cook, brushing the flour from her hands and dropping an awkward curtsy. "Did not look for you so early, ma'am. The master's already breakfasted and gone off to the far field. Won't be back till dinner." Augusta nodded and asked to be shown the pantry, the kitchen accounts, and the whole of the house, not out of idle curiosity, but because a woman accustomed to counting every candle could not walk into a new house without first taking the measure of its housekeeping, and the housekeeping, as she soon discovered, going room by room with Mrs. Pickles at her side, was arranged in the strangest of ways. The kitchen and the servants' quarters were kept modestly, almost as a laborer's household would be kept. Salt was measured out sparingly, meat was eaten on Sundays only. The candles burned here truly were tallow, not wax. But the library, small, yet full of books bound in costly leather, many with gilt edges, did not match any farm Augusta could imagine. She ran her finger along the spines and found treatises on agronomy in Latin standing beside slender volumes of Horace in the original, and this last discovery struck her more forcibly than anything else. The farmers of Derbyshire, however diligent, did not read Horace in the original of an evening after a day's labor in the fields. "Who assembled this library, Mrs. Pickles?" she asked, taking care to make the question sound as ordinary as she could, as though it meant nothing in particular. "Couldn't say, ma'am," the cook answered, looking away with the same haste with which old Josiah had looked away the evening before, speaking her new name. "The books were here when I came into service, and that's 3 years past now. The master reads a great deal of an evening, that's true enough. Can't tell you more than that, ma'am, begging your pardon." Augusta did not press further. She had long ago learned a lesson that people of her station learn earlier than most. A servant's silence says more than his words. And a person wishing to learn the truth about a house learns it not through direct questions, but through the patient observation of what is never said aloud. She spent the rest of the morning learning the house and its ways, and by noon had formed for herself a clear picture. The farm of Willowcroft was a modest but sound household, run sensibly and without waste. Its laborers paid promptly, and the master himself, Mr. Gideon Marsh, was, by all the servants' accounts, a strict and fair employer, remarkably generous wherever generosity touched another's need, yet frugal in everything concerning his own comfort. He slept in a room scarcely larger than his steward's, wore coats long out of fashion and more than once mended, and ate the same plain fare as his own laborers. And yet, in his house, there were things, porcelain, books, a length of fine Holland linen upon her own bed, which an ordinary tenant farmer could have come by from nowhere at all. Gideon Marsh returned from the far field in time for dinner, just as Mrs. Pickles had promised. Weary, in muddy boots, his face weathered by the cold February wind, and his whole bearing in that moment corresponded so entirely to the appearance of a simple farmer that Augusta felt, for an instant, ashamed of her morning's suspicions. Perhaps the books and the porcelain had indeed come to him by some chance inheritance from a childless, distant relation, and his manner of standing straight and speaking sparingly was nothing more than the natural reserve of a man unaccustomed to company. At dinner they spoke little of the state of the fields, of the price of oats, of the weather, which Gideon said promised an early spring that year, and in this sparse, business-like conversation Augusta found an unexpected relief for herself. After years spent in a house where conversation amounted either to her father's silent despair or to her own attempts to console that despair, a simple discussion of husbandry, in which all that was required of her was to offer sensible opinions rather than console anyone's grief, felt to her almost like rest. "I went round the house this morning," she said, as the meal was drawing to a close, and resolved at last to ask her question directly because directness, as she had already understood the evening before, was the one currency this man appeared to value. "You have an excellent library for a farmer's house, sir, and the porcelain in my bedchamber plainly comes from a wealthier household than this one." Gideon Marsh raised his eyes to her, and for a moment, only a moment, but Augusta caught it, something like wariness flickered in his gray eyes, the very wariness with which a man meets a question he has feared and yet, at the same time, expected. "The library came to me from a man to whom I owe a great deal," he answered at last, choosing his words slowly, as though walking on thin ice. "And the porcelain was a thing that was dear to me once, and one of the few things I thought fit to keep. Forgive me, Mrs. Marsh, if that answer seems evasive to you. There are chapters in my past I find difficult to speak of, and I would be grateful if you would allow me not to open them before I am ready to. I do not ask you to trust me blindly. I ask only for a little time." Augusta nodded and did not press the matter, because in his voice, speaking those words, she heard something familiar to her from her own father in the months after her mother's death. Not the evasiveness of a deceiver, but the caution of a man whose wound has not yet healed enough to bear touching without risk to both parties. John Bowlby, an English psychiatrist, would many years later describe how the loss of someone close can drive the survivor to build invisible walls around himself, walls that guard against fresh pain at the cost of fresh closeness. Avoidance, he wrote, grows not out of a want of feeling, but out of its very opposite, out of the memory of how dearly it costs to feel too much. Augusta had never read this work and could not have read it, but a woman who had spent 26 years watching her own father slowly extinguished by grief had no need of learned language to recognize that same extinguishing in the man sitting across from her at their modest dinner table. She resolved to herself that she would not hurry his confession, but would wait, working alongside him day after day, because trust, she understood this trade no less than she understood the trade of thrift, is earned through patience, not through questioning. The weeks that followed that conversation settled into an unhurried, almost soothing routine. Augusta took charge of the household accounts, and within 10 days had brought such order to them that Mrs. Pickles, who had before spent more on flour and butter than was needed, out of simple habit rather than true reckoning, began to look upon the new mistress with a respect bordering on awe. Augusta knew how to stretch a pound of salt beef a week longer than usual without sacrificing the quality of the table. Knew how to bargain with the village blacksmith for horseshoes at half the former price. Knew how to knit warm stockings for the farm laborers through the winter out of scraps of wool that had before been thrown away. Her practical mind, honed over years of want in her father's house, found here at Willowcroft an application not against poverty, but in service of a household that was not, in truth, nearly so poor as it wished to appear. And so her efforts turned not into mere survival, but into genuine prosperity. Josiah Hepburn, the old steward, watched these changes with a growing and ever less concealed approval. It was he who first began to trust her further than his initial guarded respect allowed. He showed her the farm's account books for the past 5 years, explained the finer points of the lease arrangements with Squire Pemberton, introduced her to the tenants of the neighboring holdings, whose regard for the new mistress grew at the same pace as the regard shown her by Mrs. Pickles herself. One evening, late in March, when Augusta sat up late in the farm office checking figures in the old ledgers, Josiah brought her a cup of hot milk with honey, a gesture of care more than a steward is meant to show a mistress of the house. And Augusta, thanking him, resolved at last to ask directly what had troubled her since her very first evening there. "Josiah," she said quietly, setting down her pen, "you have served in this house many years, I know. Tell me honestly, who was Mr. Marsh before he became a tenant farmer on Squire Pemberton's land? I do not ask out of idle curiosity. I am his wife, and I should like to understand the man to whom I have bound my life, rather than learn of him by chance through the servant's half-said words." The old man was silent for a long while, gazing into the candle's flame. And in that silence, Augusta saw the inward struggle of a man torn between loyalty to his master and a growing, month-by-month, strengthening respect for the young mistress who had proven to him, by deed rather than by word, that she deserved a great deal more trust than had thus far been given her. "I will not tell you all of it, Mrs. Marsh," he said at last, "because not all of it is mine to tell. But I will tell you this much, and I ask you to remember it well. The man you married is not who he presents himself to be, nor who he seems in muddy boots out in the far field. He has not lied to you, understand me rightly. He has simply not told you the whole truth because that truth once cost him more than you can well imagine, and he guards it the way a man guards a wound that has not yet fully healed. I have served this house longer than you have been alive, Mrs. Marsh, and I will tell you one thing for certain. Whatever he turns out to be in the end, he is an honest man. The rest you will learn in your own time, and I pray to God that time comes soon, for this house has kept its silence too long, and you, it seems to me, are the first in many years with the power to break it." He said nothing further that evening, however much Augusta tried to press him for more, and from that day a new, nearly conspiratorial warmth entered the old steward's manner toward her, as though he had silently taken her as an ally in some matter she could, as yet, only guess at. And a week later, in early April, an event occurred that pushed all her questions about her husband's past into the background. For a visitor arrived at the house of Willowcroft such as had never been seen there before. An elegant carriage bearing a coat of arms upon its door, from which stepped a young man of some 30 years, dressed in the latest fashion of London, with cold, calculating eyes and a smile too gracious to be sincere. "Announce to your master," he told the footman who opened the door, in the tone of a man accustomed to having doors open before him without delay, "that he has a visitor, Mr. Reginald Ashcroft. Tell him I have come as a neighbor to call upon an old—" he paused, smiling faintly, "an old acquaintance." Augusta, standing at that moment by the parlor window, saw old Josiah's face, who had just entered the room to announce the guest, turn white as linen at the sound of that name, and his hands, usually so steady, tightened visibly upon the door handle. Chapter 3. Reginald Ashcroft entered the house without waiting to be invited. By that small but unmistakable gesture, a man betrays his conviction that a house belongs to him more than to the one who lives in it. He stopped in the hall, drawing off his fine kid gloves with a slow, deliberate motion, and cast his eye about the simple furnishings: the unpainted ceiling beams, the worn carpet, the coat rack where hung the master's single everyday coat, with the particular superiority with which certain people regard poverty, knowing full well they will never sink to it themselves. Augusta, not yet introduced to the visitor, watched this scene from behind the half-open parlor door, and the first thing she felt at the sight of Reginald Ashcroft was not curiosity, but wariness. The wariness that wakes in a person at the sight of a predator who has not yet shown his claws, but has already chosen where to sink them. "Gideon," said Reginald, when the master of the house came out to meet him, still in his working clothes, his hands not yet washed of the morning's labor in the field. "How you have aged, dear cousin. Though I suppose the role of tenant farmer ages a man faster than the years themselves. Amusing, really, to see you in such a state. I remember you quite different." The word cousin fell into the quiet house of Willowcroft like a stone dropped into still water, and Augusta, hearing it from behind the door, felt the ground beneath her feet shift, subtly, but irrevocably. She did not rush at once toward explanations. Years spent in her father's house had taught her patient observation over hasty conclusions. But from that moment, every word spoken in the study, into which the two men had gone, shutting the door behind them, took on a weight it had not carried an hour before. "What do you want, Reginald?" Gideon's voice, reaching her through the door, muffled but distinct, was colder than Augusta had ever heard it in all the weeks of their life together. "You do not travel from London to Derbyshire for the pleasure of looking at my aging face. Speak plainly, if that is what you wish. I have more work about the farm than time for social calls." "Ah, so this is how you speak now," Reginald laughed, and in that laugh Augusta caught a note that an experienced ear unfailingly recognizes as fear disguised as mockery. "Very well, I shall be plain, since you wish it. Let me be direct, dear cousin. Word has reached me, strange word which I confess I was at first unwilling to believe. They say that you, living here these 3 years under a false name, have married. Some penniless girl, the daughter of some bankrupt baronet from Middleham Cross. Tell me it is not true, and I will relieve you of my company at once." The silence that followed these words lasted long enough for Augusta to understand. The truth needs no confirmation in words, where it is already betrayed by silence. "It is true," Gideon said at last, and in his voice Augusta heard not embarrassment but something like defiance. "I have married, and it is no business of yours, Reginald, however you came to learn of it, before I meant to tell you myself." "No business of mine?" Reginald let out a short, barking laugh without a trace of real mirth in it. Gideon, my dear fellow, with all respect for your seclusion, it is very much my business. 8 years. 8 long years you have been burying yourself in this backwater, refusing your title, your seat in Parliament, everything owed to you by birth. And all this while, forgive my frankness, but someone must tell you the truth to your face. All this while I have managed the estate as it ought to be managed, kept up the rents, paid the servants' wages, servants you abandoned in ignorance, explained your mysterious absence to the neighbors and to society by saying you were, so to speak, traveling for your health after poor Celeste's death. God rest her soul. I did this for 8 years, not out of the goodness of my heart, but because I am next in line of succession, should you, contrary to expectation, persist in your childless solitude. And I confess I had begun to believe your persistence would last forever. And now, without a single word of warning, you marry whom? Some woman of unknown origin met, from what I understand, less than 2 months ago, married in haste, in secret, like a thief in the night. Do you understand what this means for me? For my children? If you have a son, a lawful heir, Gideon, then 8 years of my life spent keeping your damned estate in order for a right I had come to consider almost my own will have been thrown to the wind. In these words, spoken with unfeigned, trembling heat, Augusta, listening from behind the door, discerned not a cartoonish malice but something far more recognizable, and therefore far more troubling. The fear of a man who had spent years living in anticipation of a future now poised to crumble to dust. Reginald Ashcroft was not a villain without cause. He was a man who had invested 8 years of his life, his labor, his time, and very probably no small share of his own hopes in an inheritance that had seemed to him nearly guaranteed. And the appearance of his cousin's lawful wife turned those 8 years, in an instant, into years lost in vain. Fear of poverty, fear of the collapse of a long-built plan. That was what sounded beneath the layer of fashionable contempt in his voice, and Augusta, who knew that fear far too well from her own recent past, could not help but feel toward him something like a grim, unwilling understanding, even without a shred of sympathy for Reginald himself. "My affairs with my wife are no concern of yours," Gideon answered, and his voice now sounded quieter but firmer than before. "You knew when you took up the management of the estate 8 years ago that it belonged to me, not to you, and that I have the right to order my own life as I see fit, marriage included. If the question of succession troubles you, apply to my solicitors in London. They will explain your rights to you at far greater length than I am presently disposed to. Now, be so good as to leave my house. I have neither the time nor the wish to continue this conversation." "Your house?" Reginald laughed again, more quietly this time, but with greater malice. "A tenant's hovel, which you call your house, while your true home stands locked up and gathering dust these 8 years because you cannot bear to look upon your late wife's portrait in the gallery without fleeing to this wretched farmer's corner. I shall leave, Gideon, since you demand it. But remember what I have said. 8 years I have upheld the appearance of your comfortable absence before the whole of society, and I do not intend to hold my tongue any longer if you mean to strip me of everything I did it for. Your young wife, I imagine, would find it of some interest to learn the whole truth about the man she has married. I do not think the village solicitors trouble themselves to explain such particulars to young brides." The study door swung open more sharply than doors are opened in a proper household, and Reginald Ashcroft stepped out into the hall, nearly colliding with Augusta, who, hearing footsteps, had retreated hastily from the parlor door, though not quickly enough to escape his attentive, appraising glance. He stopped, looking down at her with the same mixture of superiority and curiosity with which he had surveyed the house before, and a smile played upon his thin lips that struck Augusta as far more unpleasant than open rudeness would have been. "And here, I take it, is the new Mrs. Marsh," he said, inclining his head slightly in a mockery of a bow. "Allow me to wish you happiness in your marriage, madam. I assure you, your husband is a man of a rather more complicated history than one might suppose, looking at his present modest circumstances. Ask him sometime, at your leisure, about the family gallery and his true home. I am certain the conversation will prove most instructive for you both. Good day to you." He left without waiting for an answer, and within a few minutes the sound of his carriage wheels faded away toward the turnpike, leaving behind a silence so thick that Augusta could hear her own heart beating. Gideon stood in the doorway of the study, watching his departed guest with the expression of a man who has just been made to live through something long and painfully buried. And when he turned at last to face Augusta, there was such unconcealed weariness in his gray eyes that she, despite every question that had built up within her over the past weeks, could not bring herself to ask him anything in that moment. "Forgive that scene," he said quietly. "Reginald is a distant relation of mine, and our dealings, I will say, have never been marked by warmth. I understand you have likely heard more than I would have wished, and I promise you, Mrs. Marsh, that I will explain everything I am able to explain, but not today. Today I ask only for a little patience of you, which, it seems to me, you have no shortage of." Brené Brown, an American researcher, would many years later describe vulnerability not as weakness, but as the only door through which true closeness between people can enter, and would add that a man who has spent years hiding behind a wall of the unspoken fears not exposure itself, but that the truth once uncovered will make him unworthy of love in the eyes of the one to whom he has opened it. Augusta could not have read that work, but looking at the exhausted face of the man she had married 7 weeks before to save her father, and who now stood before her, asking for patience in the voice of a man far more frightened than he let show, she understood something important on her own, without need of learned words. This man had not lied to her out of contempt or calculation. He had kept silent out of fear. A fear whose nature she had yet to learn, but in whose existence she no longer doubted for a moment. "Very well," she said simply. "I will wait, Mr. Marsh. But while you delay, allow me to ask you one question, which I hope you will find it possible to answer now, rather than waiting for a more convenient hour. Your cousin mentioned a family gallery in your true home. Does that mean the house we live in together is not the only one you own?" She saw something shift in his face, not anger, not vexation, but something akin to the relief of a man finally asked the question he has long been prepared to answer, if only he could find the courage to speak first. "No," he said after a long pause. "This is not the only house I own. There is another, larger and older than this one, in a county of which I have not said a word to you. And I promise you, Augusta, this is the first thing I promise you truthfully and in full, that I will tell you everything about it that you wish to know. But not this evening. Give me a week. I need a week to find words for what I have not spoken aloud in 8 years." Chapter 4. The week Gideon Marsh had asked for himself to prepare his explanations proved to be one of the most eventful in Augusta's life. Not for what happened, but for the change that took place within her. A change so quiet and gradual that she came to understand it fully only much later, looking back. In the first days after Reginald Ashcroft's visit, Gideon behaved more cautiously toward her than usual, as though he feared that a single wrong word might shatter the fragile balance established between them over the past weeks. But this caution, as Augusta soon noticed, was not coldness, but his own, rather clumsy form of care. The care of a man unaccustomed to caring for anyone but the land beneath his feet and the people who worked that land. On the third day after his cousin's departure, an incident occurred that changed more between them more quickly than any words could have. One of the younger farm laborers, 15-year-old Tom Wicks, the vicar's nephew, thrust his hand carelessly into the millstones of the watermill while clearing a lodged stone from the mechanism, and only Gideon's swift intervention, throwing himself toward the lever that stopped the wheel, saved the boy from injury, though Gideon himself, in his haste, cut his palm open on the sharp edge of a broken paddle. The wound proved deep and bled heavily, and when Gideon was brought into the house, pale from loss of blood but stubbornly refusing help, Augusta, rather than sending for the village doctor, whose journey would have taken no less than an hour, washed the wound herself with clean water, bound it with strips torn from her own petticoat, and held his hand in hers until the bleeding stopped, as calmly and capably as she had once tended her father in his worst days. "This is not the first time you have done this," Gideon remarked, watching her sure, precise movements through a haze of pain and weakness. "Where did you learn to bind wounds, Mrs. Marsh?" "At home," Augusta answered, not lifting her eyes from the bandage. "My father once fell down a flight of stairs, split his head open. The doctor lived 3 hours' ride away, and blood does not wait for the doctor. Since then, I know how to stop bleeding, and how to tell a wound requiring immediate stitching from one that will heal with a simple binding. Yours, thankfully, is of the latter kind. Keep your hand above your heart another quarter hour, and it will heal without a trace, save for a scar." He watched her in those minutes as he had never watched her before, in all the 7 weeks of their life together. Not with the wary appraisal with which a man looks at a tool fit or unfit for the task, but with that particular quiet wonder with which a person looks at something he had long ceased to expect to find again in his life. Care given not out of duty, but out of something simpler and at the same time far rarer. John Gottman, an American psychologist who would spend decades studying the nature of marital closeness, would later describe such moments with a particular term: a bid. A moment in which one person silently extends to another an attempt at closeness, and the other either turns toward it or turns away. And it is upon how many such bids are met, rather than turned aside, that the whole future of two people who have joined their lives together depends. Augusta Marsh had never read Gottman, and could not have read him. But that evening, binding her husband's hand by the light of a single candle, she turned toward his silent bid as naturally as she breathed, and Gideon Marsh, to his own astonishment, turned toward it in return. "Thank you," he said quietly when the bandage was finished, and did not withdraw his hand, though there was no longer any need. "Not only for this, for the patience you have shown me this week. I know I do not deserve it in the measure you have given it to me." "You saved my father from prison," Augusta answered simply. "Whatever you are hiding from me, Mr. Marsh, I am prepared to believe the reason for your silence is not ill intent. Today alone was enough to show me how you threw yourself at that lever without a single thought for your own safety, to save someone else's child. A man capable of that cannot be a man I ought to fear, whatever your cousin may say." From that evening, a new closeness settled between them. Not yet a physical one, but the kind that precedes the physical and often proves stronger than it. The closeness of two people who had begun to trust one another in small things, before daring to trust in the greater matter. Gideon, recovering from his wound in the days that followed, spent more time with Augusta than before. He showed her the farm's ledgers for all 3 years of his time there, explained the system of crop rotation he practiced on his fields, a system which, to Augusta's surprise, possessed a scientific rigor beyond the reach of an ordinary working farmer. A rigor belonging, rather, to a man educated at the country's finest institutions than to one who had spent his whole life behind a plow. One evening, helping Gideon sort through the correspondence that had accumulated during his week of enforced idleness, Augusta came upon a letter lying among the other papers on his writing desk. A letter with a thick, costly seal, addressed not to Mr. Gideon Marsh, but to His Grace, the Duke of Langmore, to be delivered into his own hands. She froze, holding the envelope as though it might burn her fingers, and at that very moment Gideon walked into the room, seeing the letter in her hands before he had time to hide from her whatever must have shone upon his face. The silence that fell between them lasted longer than silence usually lasts between two people in one room, long enough for Augusta to notice how pale his face had gone, how his hand, still bandaged, had clenched into a fist at his side, as though he were preparing either to flee or to confess, not yet knowing which of the two he would choose in the next instant. "You promised me a week," Augusta said quietly, setting the letter back upon the desk with the same care one uses handling an object capable of upsetting the fragile balance of everything built around it. "Only 4 days have passed. I did not mean to open your post, Mr. Marsh, or rather, Your Grace." She pronounced the words slowly, tasting them, as if testing whether they truly belonged to the man standing before her in a plain working coat with a bandaged hand. "The letter lay open on top, and the name caught my eye before I could look away. I will not pretend I did not see it. But I promised you patience, and I shall keep that promise. The remaining 3 days are yours, as we agreed. I will not ask you another single question until they have passed, if that is your wish." She saw something shift in his face, not anger, not vexation, but something akin to the relief of a man finally being asked the question he has long been prepared to answer, at least in part, if only he could find the courage to speak first. "Not 3 days, he said at last, and his voice was hoarse, as though the words cost him more than any physical labor. "It is enough that you already know part of the truth. I will tell you the rest tonight, Augusta, all I am able to tell without my voice breaking part way through the telling, and that, I confess, will not be an easy thing for me. But first I must ask a favor of you. Come with me tomorrow to see Josiah. He knows this story better than anyone alive, save myself. He served in my true home long before I chose to vanish from the world that knew me, and he followed me here when I decided to disappear. Perhaps his words will reach you more clearly than my own, because he will tell you of the man I was before I became the man you see before you now. And I fear I will not manage to tell you of that man myself without living through his death all over again." Chapter 5. Josiah Hepburn received them not in the house, but in the small farm office, a cramped room hung with harnesses and smelling of wax and dry leather. A place that struck Augusta as unexpectedly fitting for the conversation she had waited 3 days for, and for which, as it turned out, she was nonetheless unprepared. The old man seated them on 2 plain wooden benches drawn up to the table, lit an extra candle, though it was not yet dark outside, and was silent for a long while before beginning, the way people fall silent before not telling a story, but living it through again. "I served in his father's house as a boy," he began at last, looking not at Augusta and not at Gideon, but into the space between them, as though the shadows of the people he was about to speak of still stood there in that empty air. "Started as a stable boy, worked my way up to senior footman, and after the old Duke's death, his father, that is," he nodded toward Gideon with a barely perceptible motion of the chin, "stayed on to serve the young master, then not yet a duke himself, but the Marquis of Ashdown, heir to the title, a cheerful, open young man of 22, whom I remember better than I remember myself at that age. Augusta glanced at Gideon, sitting motionless beside her, staring straight ahead with the expression of a man listening to his own epitaph read aloud, and found in his face nothing of the reserved, distrustful farmer she had grown used to over the past weeks. Before her sat a man caught in a memory, no longer master of his own countenance as he had always been before. He married young, Josiah went on, at 23, to Lady Celeste Hartley, daughter of the Earl of Waverley. Married for love, ma'am, true love, of the kind you rarely find in marriages of our sort, where people more often marry for land and dowry than for the heart. I never before saw two people so suited to one another. She was lively, quick to laugh, filled the house with laughter where before had reigned a decorous silence, and he blossomed beside her, like a field after a long drought. 3 years they lived together in complete, unclouded happiness, and the whole house, the whole neighborhood rejoiced to see them, because their happiness seemed to spread to everyone who came near it. And then, in the 4th year, Lady Celeste came with child, her first. The old man's voice broke for the first time in the whole telling, and he fell silent for several long seconds before finding the strength to go on. The labor was hard, ma'am, too hard. The doctors did everything in their power, but both mother and child, a son never christened, died within the space of one night. A night that stands before my eyes still, clearer than anything that happened to me this past week. I never saw a man change as he changed in those days. Not all at once, gradually, hour by hour, like a candle burning down from within while the flame still shows outside. He buried his wife and son in the family vault, held all the proper services, received all the proper condolences with the proper outward composure, and 2 months after the funeral announced he was going abroad to travel for his health, leaving the management of the estate to his cousin, Mr. Ashcroft, and to the senior servants. He did not travel, Augusta said quietly, not asking but affirming, for part of this story had already begun assembling itself in her mind, joining the scattered details of the past weeks into a single, coherent picture. No, ma'am, Josiah confirmed. He came here, to Derbyshire, under the name of Gideon Marsh, bought the lease from Squire Pemberton, and has lived here ever since, far from any society that once knew him. I followed him because I could not leave him alone in such a state, and because I saw that the young master needed at least one person near him who had known him before, who remembered what he had been before grief burned away everything in him except the ability to work himself to the point of collapse. We told no one the truth these 8 years. He explained his absence from society by his ill health. The rumors his cousin spread at his own urgent request took care of the rest, while he himself, meanwhile, buried himself deeper and deeper in this land, as if he hoped one day to stop being the Duke of Langmore altogether and remain simply Gideon Marsh, a man without a past, without a title, without a name to remind him every day of what he had lost. Irving Goffman wrote that a person who has suffered a heavy loss of a public, conspicuous nature often chooses the path of deliberate self-effacement from society's eye, preferring obscurity to visibility. For visibility demands the constant, exhausting effort of maintaining the image by which one was formerly known, an effort for which a grieving person simply has no strength left to spare. For 8 years, the Duke of Langmore had lived as a simple farmer precisely because a farmer, unlike a duke, was permitted to be silent, permitted not to smile at receptions, not to listen to condolences from people for whom his grief had long since become nothing more than a subject for drawing-room conversation, permitted simply to work with his hands until he sweated through and lie down to sleep without dreams of a voice that would never again sound in the house. But why not marry again, before now? Augusta asked, turning at last to Gideon, who had spoken for the first time since Josiah's account began. 8 years is a long time for a man of your position to avoid a second marriage. Your cousin, I imagine, is not the only one who counted on your remaining childless. It was not only grief, Gideon answered, and his voice now sounded steadier, as though Josiah's telling had lifted from his shoulders some part of the weight he had carried alone for 8 years. Though the grief, I confess, was strong enough in the first years that the thought of a new marriage seemed to me not merely premature, but a kind of sacrilege, a betrayal of Celeste's memory. But over time, another thing was added to the grief. A fear I found it difficult to admit even to myself. The moment word spread that the Duke of Langmore was a widower and prepared to marry again, fortune hunters would have descended upon me from every corner of the country. Not upon me, Augusta, understand me rightly, but upon the coronet of a duchess, upon the fortune, upon the position in society that such a marriage would grant them. I did not want to spend the rest of my life wondering which of the women smiling at me loved me, and which loved the crest upon my carriage door. It was simpler to disappear, to become no one, than to live in constant suspicion of everyone who showed me any regard. And then I came along, Augusta said softly. A woman who married you without the least suspicion that you were a duke, to save her father. Not for the sake of your title, of which I had not the faintest idea. Precisely so, said Gideon, and for the first time in the whole of this difficult conversation, something like a faint, uncertain smile flickered in his eyes. You are the only woman in 8 years who would have loved me. If you are able to love me at all, of which I dare not be certain, without knowing what I possess. You married a farmer, Augusta, a man without a penny beyond what was needed for a modest household, and you agreed to this life because the alternative was your father's imprisonment. I could not have devised a more honest trial than the one fate itself contrived, throwing you upon my doorstep that February day. And the longer I came to know you these past weeks, the more it frightened me to confess the truth to you, because I feared the truth would change how you looked at me, that you would begin to see the Duke of Langmore in place of Gideon Marsh, the man I would rather have remained in your eyes if I had a choice in the matter. Augusta was silent for a long while, weighing what she had heard, and Josiah, sensing that the moment required the two of them to be left alone, rose quietly from his bench and left the office, leaving them by the light of a single candle. I will not lie to you and say I am not struck by this title, she said at last, looking straight into the eyes of the man she had married 7 weeks before. But it strikes me not in the way you fear, I think. I am struck not by the fact that you are a duke, but by how many years you have carried this solitude within you alone, allowing no one to truly share it with you, save a faithful old man who followed you into exile. I know something of grief, Mr. Marsh. Forgive me, Your Grace. I have yet to learn to call you rightly. I buried my mother 3 years ago and saw how grief can slowly extinguish a person if he is left alone with it too long. I do not intend to demand that you become at once the cheerful young Marcus Josiah described. I ask only one thing. Let me stand beside you, not as a woman you hired to run your household, but as a wife you will come to trust with the rest, as you have trusted me today. Gideon looked at her for a long minute, and in his eyes stood the very same expression Augusta had seen once before, the evening she bound his wounded hand. The expression of a man allowing himself, for the first time in many years, to believe that closeness offered sincerely need not end again in loss. I must go to Langmore Park, he said at last, speaking the name of his own estate aloud, it seemed, for the first time in all their acquaintance. The steward writes that matters have accumulated requiring my presence in person, matters I have put off under one pretext or another for several months now. I would like you to come with me, Augusta, not as a guest, but as my wife, as the Duchess of Langmore, which you have been by right since the very day the Reverend Wycliffe married us in the church at Middleham Cross. But I must warn you honestly, the house has seen no mistress in 8 years. The servants there have long grown used to living without oversight. The estate has fallen into a state of neglect I confess I dread seeing with my own eyes no less than I dread seeing Celeste's portrait, which still hangs in the gallery I have not entered in all these years. This will be a hard journey for us both, but I have no right to put it off any longer, especially now that Reginald knows the truth and, I have no doubt, is already writing letters to London, laying the ground for his own claims should I lose my resolve again and choose to disappear. Augusta nodded, feeling a strange, uneasy anticipation rise in her chest. Not fear, though there was reason enough for fear, but something closer to the resolve of a person who at last has real work ahead of her. Work for which all her years of thrift and household reckoning in her father's house had, it seemed, been preparing her all her life. "I will come with you," she said simply. "When do we leave?" "The day after tomorrow," Gideon answered. "But first I must warn you of one further matter, Augusta, of which you ought to know before we arrive at Langmore Park. For Josiah, though he has told you a great deal, kept silent at my request about the last part of this story. There is a document, drawn up by my father's father many years ago, a condition in the family entail, known to few, of which even Reginald himself, I believe, knows only in part. And if this condition comes to light in the wake of what has happened this past week, the consequences will prove a good deal graver than a mere cousin's disappointment at frustrated expectations." Chapter 6. The condition Gideon had mentioned in the last moment of their conversation in the cramped farm office turned out to be a good deal stranger than Augusta had managed to imagine over the 2 sleepless nights that remained before their departure for Langmore Park. My grandfather, the 3rd Duke of Langmore, was a man of severe principles and an even severer memory of his own childhood, Gideon related, as their carriage rolled eastward, passing, one after another, the dreary February landscapes, not yet touched by the early spring he had once promised. He grew up in a house where his own father had, for years, preferred the diversions of the capital to the duties of managing his estate, and Langmore Park, under him, fell into such disrepair that my grandfather, inheriting the title while still quite young, found whole wings of the house in a state of literal ruin. The roofs leaked, the fields lay uncultivated, and the tenants suffered because there was no one to look after them. He swore this would never happen again, and he wrote into his will a condition the family's solicitors long considered excessive until quite recently. If the seat of Langmore Park remains uninhabited by the master of the house or his lawful wife for longer than 10 years together, the right to the title and the greater part of the entailed lands passes not to the direct heir, but to a collateral branch of the family, provided that branch proves before the House of Lords its readiness and ability to take up residence at once and to restore the estate. 10 years, Augusta repeated slowly, working the missing figures out in her head. And you have been absent 8 already. 8 years and 3 months, to be precise, Gideon confirmed, and there was in his voice the bitter irony of a man too long avoiding the count of his own time. Reginald knows of this condition. I have no doubt he knows, at least in broad terms, for he is clever enough and interested enough in my affairs to have long since obtained a copy of the will through his acquaintances in the court archives. That, I believe, is precisely why word of my marriage troubled him so much more than an ordinary threat from a lawful heir would have. If I now return to Langmore Park with a wife and remain there long enough to interrupt the count of those 10 years, all his years of careful reckoning collapse at once. But if I do not, if I, contrary to hope, disappear again or delay another 2 years, he will have lawful grounds to contest my right to the title in court, proving to the House of Lords that a collateral branch of the family is better fit to take charge of the estate than a duke who has spent a decade hiding from his own inheritance. This conversation explained a great deal to Augusta that had before seemed inexplicable haste. Both Gideon's sudden readiness to confide in her at last, and his resolve to travel to Langmore Park immediately, despite the whole weight of the coming encounter with a house he had left 8 years before in the depths of grief. She looked at her husband's profile, lit by the meager light of the winter day through the carriage's curtained window, and thought that this man, whom she had at first taken for a sullen farmer, had turned out to be caught up in an affair a good deal more complicated and a good deal more urgent than the simple preservation of family honor. An affair upon whose outcome depended not only his own future, but that of everyone who relied upon Langmore Park, the tenants, the servants, an entire village supported by the estate. Langmore Park opened before their eyes at the close of the second day's journey, when the carriage, having passed the last turn of the long avenue lined with old elms, came out onto a gentle rise from which the house was visible in its entirety, in all its neglected but still commanding beauty. It was a building of gray stone, raised in the previous century in strict, noble proportions, with 2 symmetrical wings extending from a central portico like the outstretched but helplessly lowered wings of some great, weary bird. Half the windows in the west wing were shuttered. Not a single wisp of smoke rose from the chimneys save 2 or 3 near the kitchens, and the lawn before the front entrance, once, no doubt, immaculately kept, had grown over with weeds so tall that the carriage wheels caught in them as they approached. "Good God," Gideon murmured, looking at the house through the glass with the expression of a man seeing the ghost of his own past. "I did not think the neglect would have gone so far." Augusta said nothing, but her gaze, trained by years of poverty to read a house's condition from the smallest outward signs, was already conducting its own ruthless survey. The roof over the east wing had sagged in 2 places, meaning leaks that had in all likelihood gone on for years. The stable yard, visible off to the side, stood nearly empty, with only 2 or 3 horses where the size of the building suggested a full dozen ought to have been kept. And the drive itself, once lined evidently with a neatly clipped hedge, had grown so wild that the hedge had become nothing more than an untidy wall of tangled branches. This was not the neglect of poverty, but of negligence. The negligence of a man entrusted with the care of another's property, who tended to it just enough to escape direct accusation, and no more. At the front entrance, a small remaining staff had gathered to greet them, with the hurried, anxious solemnity with which a long-awaited but half-forgotten master is received. A butler, an exceedingly elderly man named Penhallow, whose face showed so much suppressed emotion at the sight of Gideon that Augusta feared, for a moment, the old man might faint dead away on the very threshold. The housekeeper, Mrs. Treadwell, a woman of middle years with tired but kind eyes, who dropped into a deep curtsy, and a dozen or so lesser servants whose number, as Augusta noted with the alarm of a practiced housekeeper, was plainly insufficient for a house of this size. "Your Grace," Penhallow said in a trembling voice, "we did not dare hope. That is, we hoped, of course, but did not dare believe you would that you would truly come home." "I have come home, Penhallow," Gideon said, and his voice sounded even, though Augusta, standing beside him, could feel what that composure cost him. "And I have brought the Duchess of Langmore with me, my wife. Allow me to present her, Augusta, Duchess of Langmore." A murmur, faint but unmistakable, ran through the line of assembled servants. A murmur of astonishment and, it seemed to Augusta, of a timid, not yet daring joy, as though these people, who had lived for years in a house forgotten by its own master, had suddenly caught a glimpse of the possibility that their home might at last come back to life. Augusta answered their greetings with the same even friendliness she had shown before to the servants of Willowcroft, but inwardly she had already set to the work she could not have stopped even had she wished to, counting the number of servants against the number of rooms, noting the state of the livery, too worn for a house of ducal dignity, listening for what Mrs. Treadwell left unsaid during their first hurried tour of the household. The true shock awaited her not in the state apartments, which struck her, for all the neglect, as still grand and on the whole sound, but in the long portrait gallery of the second floor, to which Gideon led her on the second day of their stay, plainly having steeled himself for this visit in advance. The portraits of the Langmore ancestors stretched along the walls one after another, stern faces in powdered wigs and the ceremonial dress of the past century. And at the very end of the gallery, by the last window, hung the portrait of a young woman in a blue gown, with dark curling hair and a smile so full of life that Augusta involuntarily slowed her step before understanding whom exactly she stood looking at. "Celeste," Gideon said quietly, stopping beside her before the portrait. "Painted a year before her death. I have not entered this gallery in 8 years, Augusta. Not because I feared to see her face. I see it every night when I close my eyes. But because I feared to see, here, in this house, proof of how quickly life goes on without her. How quickly the house she loved has begun to fall to ruin, as if forgetting her along with me." Augusta stood beside him before the portrait of his late first wife and felt not what another woman in her place might, perhaps, have felt, not jealousy, not wounded pride, but the quiet, calm understanding of a person who has buried someone close and knows the value of such memory. She said nothing falsely comforting, did not try to assure him that the pain would pass. She simply stood beside him, letting silence be answer enough, until at last she spoke the only thing that seemed to her worth speaking in that moment. "She was beautiful, Gideon, and this house deserves to remember not only her death, but her life as well. Let me help you bring it back to life. Not to erase her memory, but so that memory might finally stop being the only thing living within these walls." It was at that very moment when Gideon, turning to her with an expression of gratitude that needed no words, seemed for the first time in 8 years on the point of truly smiling, that Mrs. Treadwell hurried into the gallery, an account book in her hands, wearing the face of someone forced to deliver bad news at the worst possible moment. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said, somewhat out of breath, "but I have discovered something in the estate's account books while preparing them for your inspection, of which I believe you ought to know at once, before you continue your tour of the house. Mr. Ashcroft, who has managed the affairs of the estate on your behalf these 8 years, has, I am nearly certain, Your Grace, kept a double set of books these past 3 years, though I dare not say so with full certainty, not having the proper authority to judge such matters. The sums recorded as paid out to the tenants for the repair of their cottages do not match what I see with my own eyes, riding out through the village. The roofs leak, Your Grace, while the money for mending them, if the books are to be believed, was spent long ago." Chapter 7. The news brought by Mrs. Treadwell plunged Gideon into a state bordering on the cold anger Augusta had witnessed only once before, on the day of Reginald's visit to Willowcroft. But this time, instead of spilling out into words, that anger turned inward, into a resolve as quiet as it was unbending. "Bring me all the account books for the past 3 years," he told the housekeeper, "and send for Mr. Crawford, the estate's solicitor in Derby. I want an independent man, tied neither to me nor to Mr. Ashcroft by any obligation, to check every figure before I bring charges that cannot afterward be taken back." Augusta, listening to this exchange, felt within herself the same active calm she had felt 7 weeks before, taking up the account books of Willowcroft for the first time. The calm of a person for whom a chaos of figures is not cause for despair, but a task requiring methodical, patient solving. "Let me help you, Gideon," she said. "I am no solicitor, that is true, and my opinion will carry no weight in a court of law. But I know how to read an account book more closely than most clerks do, because for me, those figures have for years meant the difference between dinner and hunger, not merely entries in a ledger. Let me work alongside Mrs. Treadwell while Mr. Crawford rides from Derby. The sooner we have a clear picture, the sooner you will be able to act with certainty rather than mere suspicion." Gideon looked at her a long moment in which she read not doubt in her abilities. Of that, it seemed, he had already been fully convinced at Willowcroft, but a new, growing wonder at how naturally this woman, who had entered his life 7 weeks before to save her father from the debtor's prison, now took upon herself the care of an entire estate's salvation without waiting to be specially asked, and yet without intruding where her help would not have been welcome. "Very well," he said. "Work with Mrs. Treadwell. But promise me you will be careful, Augusta. If my suspicions prove true, and Reginald has indeed been diverting funds meant for the tenant's needs, he will stop at nothing to conceal his tracks once he learns the inquiry has begun." For the next 10 days, Augusta worked in the small estate office alongside Mrs. Treadwell and Mr. Crawford, who had come from Derby, a man dry and pedantic but scrupulously honest. And the work, however wearying to the eyes over the long hours by candlelight, brought her a strange, nearly forgotten satisfaction. At last, her gift for seeing truth through a tangle of figures served not the survival of one impoverished family, but the restoration of justice for dozens of people whose names she found, page after page, in the old rent books. The scheme they gradually pieced together proved dismayingly simple in its cruelty. Reginald Ashcroft, managing the estate on behalf of his absent cousin, had been drawing from the estate's income sums officially earmarked for the repair of tenants' cottages, for the upkeep of drainage ditches, for the purchase of new livestock to replace those lost. But the greater part of these sums had settled not in the pockets of tradesmen and contractors, but in his own accounts, disguised behind false receipts and invented names of recipients. "He did not do this out of pure greed," Augusta remarked one evening, setting down her pen after a particularly long day of reckoning, speaking to Gideon, who had come to check on her work. "Look at the dates, Gideon. This scheme began 3 years ago, no earlier. And 3 years ago, if the letters we found among the other papers are to be believed, Mr. Ashcroft's eldest son entered Oxford, and his own small estate in Surrey, inherited from his mother, had been mortgaged twice over, owing to some failed investment in a coal venture that went bankrupt within its first year. He stole to keep his son at university and to save his own house from being sold at auction. Stole from people who could scarcely make ends meet as it was, because he saw no other way to keep up appearances before a society he believed would soon be his by right of inheritance." She said this not in Reginald's defense. His crime was no less grave for such an explanation, and the tenant's suffering, years spent patching leaking roofs with their own meager means, was no less real. But she said it because she had long ago learned a simple truth, bought at the price of her own years of want. The fear of poverty drives people to acts that look, from a distance, like pure evil, and up close prove to be the wretched, desperate attempt of someone to keep from falling over an edge into an abyss into which he himself has long been staring. Erich Fromm, who would study decades later the nature of human destructiveness, would observe that need, driven to the point of desperation, is capable of twisting the most ordinary human impulses. Care for one's own child, the wish to preserve an ancestral home, into acts destructive to others. Augusta could not have read this book, but a woman who had married a stranger to save her father from the debtor's prison understood, far too well, to what extremity fear of losing one's home and one's name could drive a person. To judge Reginald with cold hatred alone, even while she felt compassion for every dispossessed tenant whose name she found among the false receipts. Mr. Crawford, on completing his independent review, presented a finding that left no room for doubt. Over 3 years, a little more than £4,000 had been unlawfully diverted from the estate's income, a sum sufficient not only to fully restore every dilapidated tenant cottage, but to set much of the house itself in order as well. Armed with his finding, Gideon wrote to Reginald, demanding his immediate presence at Langmore Park to answer for himself. A letter composed with cold, legal precision, but without a single word of personal fury, which, as Augusta noted, cost him far more than giving his anger free rein would have. Reginald arrived 4 days later, a good deal less self-assured than at their first meeting at Willowcroft. Augusta, watching his arrival from the parlor window, noted that even his elegant carriage looked less brilliant than before, as though even his outward polish now came to him with greater effort than it once had. The conversation, held in Gideon's study, lasted more than 2 hours, and Augusta, waiting for the outcome in the next room with Mrs. Treadwell, heard through the door raised voices breaking off into shouting, and then long stretches of heavy, unkind silence. When Reginald finally emerged from the study, his face was ashen, and his hands, once encased in immaculate kid gloves, were now bare and visibly trembling. He stopped for a moment before Augusta, and in his eyes she saw not the former contemptuous superiority, but something far more human, and for that very reason far heavier to witness. The fear of a man who has finally seen what 8 years of his own desperate efforts to stay afloat have come to. "He will not bring a suit against me," Reginald said hollowly, speaking less to Augusta than to himself. "Your husband, madam, has proven more merciful than I had any right to expect after I myself came to his house with threats. He asks only for the full return of the stolen sum. In installments I shall be able to manage without wholly ruining my own family, and my immediate removal from all management of the estate's affairs. Tell me, madam," he looked at her with an expression close to despair, "you had a hand, I gather, in uncovering this whole affair. Do you know that my son will lose his place at the university if I find no way to pay this sum without losing what little remains to me?" Augusta looked at him a long, calm moment, weighing her answer as carefully as she had once weighed every penny of her father's household. "I wish your son no harm, Mr. Ashcroft," she said at last. "And I believe my husband, for all the justice of his anger, wishes him no harm either. Otherwise, he would have demanded immediate and full repayment rather than installments that allow you to keep at least a measure of your dignity. But the tenants of this estate froze for 8 years beneath leaking roofs, while you found the means for your son's Oxford education. And that, sir, cannot go without consequence, however understandable your original desperation may seem to me. Perhaps you might think not of how to escape the consequences, but of how, going forward, to build your own well-being without destroying another's." Reginald found no answer to this and left the house that same evening, quitting Langmore Park in silence, never to appear in this story again. And with his departure, Augusta felt not the triumph of victory over an enemy, but rather the weary, sobering relief of someone who has just finished difficult but necessary work. That same evening, when the house had at last grown quiet after a long, exhausting day, Gideon found Augusta in the library, sitting by the fire with an open but unread book upon her lap, lost in her own thoughts of the £4,000 now to be distributed among the dozens of families in need, and of where best to begin that work come morning. "I have thought a great deal today while I spoke with Reginald," Gideon said, taking the chair across from her, "about how many years I allowed this house, and the people in it, to suffer for my own absence, sheltering behind grief as an excuse for doing nothing. Reginald stole from the tenants, and that is a crime for which there is no excuse. But who, tell me honestly, Augusta, let him into that role 8 years ago, rather than bearing the burden that was rightfully mine? Who let the house fall to ruin and the people fall into hardship because he chose to hide from his own pain in a farmer's cottage many miles away?" "You did not steal their money, Gideon," Augusta answered gently but firmly. "You grieved, and your grief was real, not a pretended shelter from responsibility. There is a difference between a man who withdraws for a time to heal a wound before taking up arms again, and a man who uses that wound as an excuse never to take up arms at all. You came back the moment you learned the truth of how great the harm had grown. That is the difference between you and your cousin, and that difference, believe me, means far more to the tenants of this estate than 8 years of your absence. Because what matters now is not how many years you were gone, but what you do now that you have returned." Gideon gazed long into the fire, turning her words over, and then raised his eyes to her, and in them, Augusta saw for the first time with full clarity, not the gratitude of a business partner, nor the wary trust of a man healing an old wound, but something simpler and at the same time more complicated. The beginning of a feeling for which neither of them had yet found the courage to name a word. "Less than 2 years remain before those 10 my grandfather set are up," he said quietly. "If we stay here, Augusta, if you choose to remain with me in this house not out of obligation to the bargain we struck 7 weeks ago, but of your own free will, I promise you we will restore Langmore Park not merely to preserve my right to the title, but to give back to this house and to these people everything they lost during the years of my flight. But I need to know for certain, before we begin this work together, do you remain here out of duty to the bargain we made that February day, or is there something more in your heart now, keeping you beside me? Now that you know the whole truth about me, the good part and the ill." Chapter 8. Augusta did not answer at once, not because she did not know the answer, but because she felt that the question deserved not a hasty word thrown out into the warmth of the fire, but an honesty as carefully built as her whole life had been built until this day. "I would have stayed here out of duty alone," she said at last, "because the vow I gave you in the church at Middleham Cross is no empty sound to me, whatever brought me to that altar that evening. But the truth, Gideon, is simpler and far more stubborn than any duty. I do not wish to leave this house, not because I am obliged to remain in it, but because these past 7 weeks, no, these past 2 months, if I am honest, I have ceased to be able to imagine myself without it. Without Josiah grumbling over the morning accounts. Without Mrs. Pickles, who stole from me the recipe for a pudding I used to make for my father. Without you reading Horace of an evening with the face of a man pretending not to notice that I am watching him from behind a book I long ago stopped reading myself. I do not know the name for the thing you fear to say first, Your Grace. But if it is that, this inability to imagine a future without you in it, then yes, I remain here of my own choosing, not from the obligation of a bargain." Gideon did not answer in words. He rose, crossed the narrow space between their chairs, and knelt beside her. Not as a supplicant, but as a man wishing to see her face level with his own, and took her hands in his, the very hands she had bandaged 3 weeks before in the office at the farm, and kissed them, first one, then the other, with the same tenderness with which one touches something one fears to lose a second time in life. "Then let me tell you what I have been afraid to say since the evening you bound my hand at Willowcroft," he said quietly. "I believed I had buried my capacity to love along with Celeste 8 years ago. And for 8 years I told myself this was for the best, that a man who has once lost everything ought not risk it again." "You did not destroy that belief with loud words or passionate declarations, Augusta, but by the way you held a teacup before the bailiffs on the day that should have been the most terrible of your life, and by the way you took up this household's account books as though they had always belonged to you. I love you, not for saving my estate or my tenants, though I love you for that too, but because you are the one person who ever saw in me not a duke and not a farmer, but simply a man deserving of a second chance." The spring of 1821 came early to Langmore Park, just as Gideon had once foretold, standing on the threshold of his life as a farmer. And with the spring came work such as this land had likely not seen since the days of that sternest of the Dukes of Langmore, the very grandfather who had set the condition of the 10 years. Augusta set about restoring the house and the estate with the same methodical resolve with which she had once mended her father's tablecloths, and stretched a pound of salt beef over 2 weeks instead of 1. But now what lay at her disposal was not the pennies of an impoverished family, but the £4,000 honestly returned by Reginald Ashcroft, and the full trust of a husband who had granted her sole management of the household and the greater part of the estate's business, while he himself worked to restore his standing with the House of Lords and to prepare the documents proving the final and permanent return of the Duke of Langmore to his ancestral seat. She began not with the state apartments, as someone concerned only with outward impression might have done, but with the tenants' cottages, whose leaking roofs Mrs. Treadwell had spoken of on their very first day at the estate. Augusta rode out personally to every farm, every cottage, drew up a detailed list of the repairs required with a precision that astonished even the seasoned Mr. Crawford, and hired roofers and carpenters not at the first price offered, but through the same shrewd bargaining she had learned in her father's house, securing better work for less money than the steward's original estimate had allowed. By midsummer, every cottage that Reginald's false receipts had listed as repaired stood truly repaired, and the village surrounding Langmore Park faced winter, for the first time in many years, without fear of a leaking roof. Josiah Hepburn, who had moved with the young master and mistress from Willowcroft to Langmore Park, where he had been offered the honored post of head steward of the entire estate, a post he confessed he had never dared hope for after so many years serving as mere overseer of a small farm, became for Augusta not only a helper in matters of the household, but the living memory of the house, helping her understand not only the figures in the ledgers, but the people behind those figures. Which tenant family had served the Langmores 3 generations running and deserved particular consideration in the distribution of new land grants? Which widow needed help she would never ask for herself? Which of the old servants, remaining in the house since Gideon's father's time, held secrets of the estate known to no one else? By that autumn, the house had transformed so completely that neighbors, long accustomed to driving past the shuttered windows of Langmore Park, began stopping their carriages at the gates, drawn by simple human curiosity, and Augusta, rather than hiding from this attention as a less confident woman might have done, began receiving her neighbors with the same practical directness, free of society's affectations, with which she conducted all the estate's other affairs. She held not lavish balls, which would have demanded expenses the estate, for all its present prosperity, could not yet afford without shortchanging the tenant's more pressing needs, but modest, impeccably arranged dinners and evenings, at which the talk turned less on fashionable London gossip than on questions of crop rotation, market prices for wool, and the state of the local roads. And gradually, month by month, a reputation began to form in society for the new Duchess of Langmore, not as a beauty or a leader of fashion, but as a mistress of rare practical sense, whose judgment in matters of husbandry was valued by her neighbors as highly as, and sometimes more highly than, that of their own stewards. It was this reputation, rather than any sensational tale of her marriage, that led to the event which became, for Augusta, an unexpected but deeply earned recognition of all she had achieved in the past year. In early spring the following year, as the 10-year term set by Gideon's grandfather drew to a close within a matter of weeks, a representative of the House of Lords, sent to make a formal inspection of Langmore Park's condition as required by law, an inspection that, under other circumstances, might have proven catastrophic for the family, had they not restored the estate in time, arrived at the house, expecting to find the neglected household of a runaway duke who had barely managed to cover the traces of 8 years' negligence. Instead, he found repaired cottages, full barns, well-tended fields, and a village whose people spoke with a rare unanimity for those usually sparing in their praise of their betters, not of the duke who had returned at the 11th hour to save his own title, but of the duchess who, in a single year, had done more for their welfare than 3 generations of previous estate managers combined. "I must note in my report to the court, Your Grace," said the representative, taking his leave of Gideon after a 3-day inspection, "that the condition of the Langmore estate not merely satisfies the terms of your grandfather's will, but exceeds it to a degree I confess I did not expect to find in any noble household in my recent years of service. Allow me to convey my particular respects to your wife, whose efforts, it appears, have been the chief cause of this revival." Josiah Hepburn, standing nearby during this exchange, could scarcely restrain a smile, far too broad for a man of his reserved temperament. And when the representative had at last departed, and Gideon turned to his wife, standing by the study window with an unaccustomed expression of embarrassed, almost shy pride upon her face, the old steward allowed himself a remark that, had he made it a year before, would have struck Augusta as extraordinary impertinence, but now sounded simply like an honest, well-earned truth. "In 40 years of service to this house, Mrs. Marsh, forgive me, Your Grace." Josiah still sometimes confused the names, to Augusta's and his own quiet amusement. "I have never seen one pair of hands do so much for these people as yours have done in a single year. The old Duke, your father-in-law, God rest his soul, would be prouder of this house today than he ever was of it in his own lifetime." Gideon came and stood beside his wife at the window, looking with her out over the fields, green with early shoots stretching to the horizon, at the smoke rising in steady columns from the chimneys of the repaired cottages, at the village come back to life after so many years of stagnation. And Augusta, looking upon all this prosperity built by her own hands, felt not the triumph of vanity another woman in her place might, perhaps, have felt, but something deeper and quieter, a calm, final certainty that a life which had begun with a desperate bargain on the threshold of a debtor's prison had found, at last, a meaning she would never have dared to imagine on that cold February morning. "Do you know what I am thinking, looking at all this?" she asked her husband quietly. "I am thinking of the old millstone at Willow Croft, of the day you cut your hand saving young Tom. I believed then that I was only doing what any sensible mistress of a house ought to do. I did not understand yet that a house is not merely a building to be looked after, but living people, whose fate depends on someone caring for their troubles as closely as he cares for his own accounts. My father once told me he had failed everyone he loved because he could not hold on to what had been entrusted to him. I like to think I have not repeated his mistake. Not because I am cleverer or stronger than he was, but because you gave me the chance to put the one skill poverty ever taught me to work in a cause truly worthy of it. Her father, invited to spend the first anniversary of their marriage as a guest at Langmore Park, stood that evening upon the terrace of the house, looking out over the lit windows of the village below, and Augusta, watching him from a distance, saw for the first time in many years not a trace of the hunted shame that had stood in his eyes that February morning when the bailiffs knocked at their door. She went to him, stood beside him, and for a long while the two of them said nothing, looking together at the work of her hands spread out before them in the evening dusk. Not as a finished story requiring an epilogue by the fireside, but as the beginning of something that would go on for many years yet, harvest after harvest, cottage after cottage, child after child. In the village school Augusta was, at that very time, laboring to open, funded by the very household economies her own strict management had made possible. "You did not fail me, Father," she said at last, taking his hand just as she had taken it that February morning when both their worlds had stood on the point of collapse. "You gave me a life in which I learned not to fear hard work. And that life, as it turned out, was worth a great deal more than the £942 that very nearly tore us apart forever."